Basically, the idea is that there is a holy space whose soil is holy, whose people are holy, and whose church is holy, and they're unified under the Moscow Patriarchate.
I call it Putinization, and it's something that we need to address, really. And I kind of advocate for this point, that we need at this moment the deputinization of Orthodoxy.
Hello, welcome along to today's show. If you're watching here on YouTube via video, then do make sure to like today's video, subscribe to the channel, and you can get more of these conversations on our regular podcast and by subscribing to our newsletter. The link is with today's show. Well, today we're looking at the religious roots of Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. Father Cyril Hovorun and Clifford Longley join me. And the world has watched in shock at the invasion of Ukraine over the last week. Our news feeds have been filled with the bombings, the casualties, the fleeing refugees, the economic sanctions being levied on Vladimir Putin's Russia by Western powers. But what's not been covered in depth is that this is not merely a geopolitical crisis, but that there is a religious background to this war. Over a millennia ago, another Vladimir the Great, was converted to the Orthodox Church, effectively creating a Russian Orthodox Church that encompassed modern-day Ukraine and Belarus. Well, Putin wants to reunify these countries by force, not just to bring back a sort of Soviet-style USSR, but because he believes in the spiritual destiny of so-called Holy Rus. So joining me to discuss this crisis and its religious roots are Father Cyril Hovorun and Clifford Longley. Father Cyril is an Orthodox priest and scholar from the Ukraine, but currently teaching at St. Ignatius College in Sweden. Clifford Longley is a Catholic journalist, regular contributor to The Tablet, and his recent articles there have covered the religious background to this conflict. So thank you very much, Cyril and Clifford, for joining me on the show today. Let's start with you, Cyril, as someone who obviously comes from Ukraine. Just a sense of your own personal reaction when you saw that invasion begin last week. What are your own feelings as Ukrainian?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the show, and I'm glad and obliged to share my experiences, my thoughts about what is going on. Probably it's premature to reflect properly on what is going on. So our reactions are very basic. Usually it's the reaction of survival for most people. The only thing they want at the moment is to survive. At the same time, they try to fight back and try to protect their country. They're very heroic. It's really unthinkable what they do, what people do. And essentially, every person in Ukraine or outside Ukraine feels this kind of shock, experiences tragedies, is very much concerned about the life of the dear people. I just had a conversation before we started our recording. I had a conversation with my family back in Ukraine, and well, they are safe more or less, even though they are in a shelter in the western part of Ukraine. They have to go to the shelter, to the basement when they hear sirens, because the Russians launch missile attacks and airstrikes from the territory of Belarus over their heads, essentially. I'm more concerned about my brother, who is kind of soldier. He was signed up. He signed up. I just heard a report from my in-laws who stayed in Kiev. They were stuck in Kiev. My family, like my immediate family, was very lucky enough to evacuate the city just 1 hour after the war started. The other part of the family was not so lucky, and they are stuck, and they were in the area of an airfield, Rostomel. It's a military airfield, which was heavily bombarded, and they lived like inside a volcano. So essentially, it's for most people, it's about survival, and also about trying to do something to fighting back. I think people are really heroic.
Well, they are, and I think everyone has been stunned at the resolve of the Ukrainian people in this moment, Cyril. It has been breathtaking, but obviously a tragedy nonetheless that ordinary people are being called to take up arms and to defend their country. And well, obviously for your family, we pray safety and peace and a swift end to this conflict, if that is possible. But we'll come back to you in a moment to kind of pull out the theological aspect of all of this. Clifford Longley also joins us. Clifford, thank you for these articles you've been writing for the tablet, which I found extremely helpful in spelling out some of the background, the religious background to this, which many people I think are simply unaware of. Just before we delve into that, yourself, have you had experience in Eastern Europe and these particular issues? Does that go back some way for you?
Well, my heart goes out to all the people in Ukraine who are suffering under these hammer blows, and in particular I'd like to tell Father Cyril that I personally will pray for his family, and that they should be safe and should come through this in one piece, and that matters to me quite a lot, to feel an identification. I don't personally know Russia or Ukraine. I do, however, have one quite visceral reaction to what we've been seeing on television, because I was, believe it or not, a war baby, and I immediately recognized the sound of an air raid siren as something that really makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Even now, after all this time, those visceral reactions are still there. And indeed, I was being bombed, and it was Hitler's intention to wipe out me and my family. So, though I wasn't very conscious of this at the time, I do remember when Hitler was killed, when Hitler died, because my sister woke me up to tell me. But nevertheless, I have that visceral feeling that what it's like in a very sort of diluted way, because being in Kiev or one of the other large cities under attack at the moment must be just about as stressful an experience as one can possibly imagine. My reaction also is, if you like, a sense of shame, recognizing that Christianity or a certain version of Christianity is a component in the cause of this trouble. And I think that is equally horrifying to me, that if it were purely secular, well, I think we would know where the chess pieces stood on the board. But once you mix religion into it, even in an insincere or distorted, indeed even perverted way, which I believe to be the case here, nevertheless, we do share some responsibility for that. I remember when I was covering for the Times religion, which I did for a long time, going to Geneva to the headquarters of the World Council of Churches, and I was taken aside by a press officer there who said to me, well, if you're dealing with the Russian Orthodox Church, don't forget, every third archimandrite is KGB. At that point, 3 archimandrites walked towards us, and I was wondering which of those 3 was the KGB man, reporting to the KGB apparatus. No, it's a serious point. It does indeed indicate something which is relevant to the present situation, which is the relationship between church and state in Russia itself. The Russian Orthodox Church has got a close alignment with the Putin government. I don't know what to call it, a regime, because that sounds as if I'm trying to insult it. But the apparatus of the state and the apparatus of the Russian Orthodox Church are quite closely entwined. However, one does notice that Patriarch Kirill has been rather quiet lately, and I haven't detected any strong comment from him after this begun. We do know that the Church itself shares quite a lot of the theological or ideological basis on which Putin is acting, and there are various quotes on the record from leading Russian Orthodox figures in Russia on the subject of what Putin's been saying, that there is, as it were, a holy Russia, a mystical being, a mystical entity to which Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are held to share. And I'm not quite sure whether we can understand that in the West, because we don't have the same identification between land and soil and religious faith. We have had in the past. I think if you go back 100 or 200 years, you will find a close identification between the Church of England and the soil of this country. But I think that's very largely diminished to the point of disappearing. We don't have, therefore, that sense of identification.
We'll come to sort of spelling out the history here in just a moment's time. Just to say, though, that obviously this show is being broadcast at a slightly later date to when it's being recorded. It's a fast evolving situation. What we can say, as of now, recording on Wednesday the 2nd of March, is that the Ukrainian people are putting up a much stronger defence of their country than we think Putin probably anticipated. But the situation obviously is still critical for them. The invasion is intensifying. And in an age of smartphones, we're seeing constant footage every day of people seeing their cities come under sustained attack, being forced to flee and so on. In fact, just earlier in the week, a friend of my show colleague Peter Sergey sent us these images, which we'll be able to show now, of the destruction and carnage in his own area, along with a message saying, "Hello, Peter, it's hard to write. As you know, there is a real war in Ukraine, especially in the capital of Ukraine, Kiev, where we live. Enemies with extreme hatred and anger bomb our city, destroy kindergartens, houses, surrounded and blocked the city. People are sitting in bomb shelters underground. Please pray for our family." At 5 a.m, a fighter jet was blown up over our house. Praise the Lord, it fell 3 streets away from our house, but it was so scary our children started crying from fear. We got in a car and ran out of the city to no idea where. Now, a Christian family near the border are hosting us, but still we're not sure if there's any safe place in Ukraine. So that's just one message of many, that could have been recounted, but this is a personal friend of the show who's getting in touch with that. This is the reality of the war that's being waged just at this moment. Perhaps we'll start with you, Cyril, on just explain to us something of this history. I mean, a lot of people have just assumed, Putin's gone mad. Why on earth would he risk, economic ruin and everything else on the basis of what seems like a land grab? But this sort of desire for Ukraine goes much deeper than that, doesn't it? Do you want to sort of fill us in on some of the religious history that informs this particular war, first of all, Cyril?
Yes, exactly. It seems, and it is quite clear, that Putin is obsessed and possessed by the idea of taking Ukraine. It's irrational. It's not pragmatic. It's against any pragmatism, any realism. He destroys his own country for the sake of retaking Ukraine, which is kind of increasingly unlikely, it seems. And one can explain this behavior only when one takes into consideration a non-rational, non-secular dimension, I would say. From the secular perspective, Putin is non-understandable, unpredictable. That's what puzzled many Western leaders, I think, because they could not read his mind, because they perceived him as one of themselves, a secular leader with a pragmatic approach to things, but he is not. He is driven by a sort of metaphysics. I would not call it religion, really. It's really a sort of metaphysical outlook, which I believe to be dangerous. And it's really interesting and helpful in this situation to analyze this metaphysical outlook, where it comes from. Yes, there is a component of kind of traditional Christianity in it, orthodoxy. Yes, he was brought up in a non-religious environment. As an atheist, he became a member of the Communist Party. He was a member of the KGB, and by definition, no one could be a believer in the KGB, as we know. And then his kind of career in the KGB changed when the Soviet Union collapsed. It seems that he got disappointed in the communist ideology. It is still clear from his statements, his addresses. And he became some kind of non-ideological personality. He had some experience of conversion, according to himself and the people who knew him. But what kind of conversion it was? I would argue that the sort of religion or metaphysics he converted in reflects much better the situation of post-Soviet or late Soviet religiosity than traditional Christianity itself. The Christianity which had been adopted by Knyaz Vladimir, Prince Vladimir in Kiev, as you mentioned, more than 1,000 years ago. This post-Soviet sort of religiosity, I would argue, is very simplistic. I would call, just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. He talked about cheap grace. I would talk about cheap spirituality that Putin adopted. It's ritualistic. It's superstitious. That's why people are amazed how much Putin observes, like numbers. It seems to be, it's crazy, but he seems to be very much in numerology. Like he started his campaign against Georgia on the 8th of 2008. And he started his campaign. The first troops were brought to Ukraine from the eastern borders on the 22nd of the 2nd of 22. So this kind of crazy numerology is very much embedded, it seems, in his spirituality. And also there are reports that he, consults all sorts of spiritual charlatans who are not really kind of priests or traditional Christians. So it's a mix of kind of post-Soviet metaphysics, superstition, and I would call it dualistic worldview. The worldview that sees the world in black and white. And for him, certainly, for Putin, the world he sees it's very quite Manichaean. It's dualistic. It means that there is a part of the world which is good, essentially good for him, and he believes this is Russia. And there is a part of the world which is essentially bad for him, and he believes this is the West. So essentially, his war against the West, because what he does in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine; it's about the West, essentially, about the conquering the West, about the retaliating the West. He wants to destroy it through Ukraine. Ukraine is used as a proxy, and for him, what he does in Ukraine, what he does against the West, we should remember, the poisoning in Salisbury. Of course, we need to remember all sorts of crimes against humanity, including on the American soil, like intervention into the election process and so forth. So it's a campaign, it's a global campaign, and for him, this is like a cosmic task, I would say. It's like it's a thing, a work with the cosmic dimension. Yes, he is a madman. But he is a calculating personality, and he is driven by this kind of worldview, which reflects what I've described. That's my take on him.
It's incredible to hear that, and very much tallies with the article you wrote at the outbreak of this invasion, Clifford. Do you want to just sort of add a bit of the history there? Because I think for people to sort of get a sense of this, what happened 1,000 years ago when Vladimir the Great adopted Christianity and so on, or at least the account we have of that, helps to inform what Putin has in the back of his mind when he launches this invasion. Give us a bit of that background.
Well, a key phrase here is Holy Rus, R-U-S, and its center was Kiev for a long time, which is why Kiev is still so important to Putin now. In other words, Moscow, if you like, was a suburb of Kiev rather than the other way around. I'm not sure Moscow even existed 1,000 years ago, to be honest with you. So it's steeped in that kind of history. It was founded as, I don't think they had the concept of the nation state in 980 AD, if that was the right year, but it was certainly a unified entity. And I think you're quite right to say metaphysical, or even mystical notion of the three parts of it being Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And they were ruled by the Tsar, who had a special duty from God to protect it from its enemies. And its enemies were to the west. Indeed, to some extent, its enemies were Catholic. There were a lot of tension between the Poles, the Polish, and Lithuanians, who are both Catholic nations, or were, historically speaking, Catholic nations, regarded as the embodiment of what was being threatening to Holy Rus. There have been wars, the territorial boundaries have changed, shifted here and there, indeed, and shifted again after the Second World War. But basically the idea is that there is a holy space whose soil is holy, whose people are holy, and whose church is holy, and they're unified under the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, the interesting question is, to what extent does this ideology, metaphysical ideology of Putin, chime with the understanding of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and to what extent is he very much, as I think wouldn't be surprised to find, an outlier in terms of that ideology? I know we can find remarks by Moscow Patriarch spokespeople saying that there is such a thing as Holy Rus and it ought to be protected from its enemies, but I don't know that the whole package that you so eloquently described, Cyril, is subscribed to by, shall we say, Patriarch Kirill. And I think that is an interesting question. Is there full support from the religious authorities in Moscow for Putin's attitude, approach, policy, outlook, and indeed policy? That's the key question now. Or is there in fact a tension between him and what I would have thought of as the much purer kind of Christianity that is represented by the Moscow Patriarchate? And by purer, I mean faithful to the gospel. I mean aware of and obedient to the precepts of the Sermon on the Mount, say, which are not about assaulting your neighbour and damaging him. They're about suffering. They're about the sacrosanct nature of suffering, how it is, as it were, spiritualized, and therefore not necessarily to be regarded as in all circumstances and evil. And you can see examples in the Second World War of people who took an almost pacifistic line. I'm thinking of Bonhoeffer, for example, but who were absolutely resistant to Nazi ideology. And I can't tell, and you might be able to give some glimpse on this, Cyril, to what extent the Moscow Patriarch share Putin's outlook, or whether he is, I strongly suspect, a bit of an outlier.
And to respond to that, Cyril, as well, I have heard this phrase used, I think, in that sort of rather rambling sort of justification that that Putin made for the invasion a week or two back. He talked about reunification in this sacred space. So evidently this is a significant part of his thinking. So yeah, but to what extent is that shared or an outlier as regards the Russian Orthodox Church in your view?
Yes. Indeed, there is certainly a connection, to say the least. Well, I mentioned that Putin was disappointed when he left, the party and switched to another sort of activity. He became a kind of a member of the local mafia group in St. Petersburg. He became disappointed in any ideology, in communist ideology, and for a long time he remained, I would say, a non-ideological person. Even when he became the president in 2000, I don't believe he really aligned with any ideology. But what happened then, there was an offer from the Russian church, an offer of a sort of ideology to substitute the communist ideology. This ideology was created, designed from the beginning by the Russian church. Well, essentially, to be more precise, the Russian church took an ideological construct which had appeared in the 90s, had been constructed by some liberal political scientists in Russia in the 90s, the concept of the Russian world, and changed it, refurbished it to a kind of fully fledged ideology, which was probably not exactly an ideology. Again, it's more appropriate to call it mythology, and it includes exactly this idea of the Holy Rus, as mentioned by Clifford, the idea of the sacred space to be protected, and the Russian Church, and particularly Patriarch Kirill himself, he is the father, and the Church is actually the author of this ideology, and the Russian Church managed to offer, I would say, to sell this ideology to Kremlin, to Putin. And Kremlin adopted it. I remember very well because I worked in Moscow at the time. And I remember very, very well the moment or the period, the very short period of time when the Kremlin adopted the language of the church in describing its political goals. At some point, there was a convergence of rhetorics of the church and of the Kremlin, with the church playing the leading role in producing this rhetoric. And when I listened to Putin just a week ago, before he launched his attacks against Ukraine, I heard the voice of the church. I heard the argumentation, the tropes which had been produced by the church. So what the church has done, the church has supplied the Kremlin, which was completely unideological, which was concentrated, on gaining, economic wealth and, exporting money to the West, including the UK, and exporting oligarchs who landed in the UK and, filled with their money the coffers of the British banks. And it's not just about British. It's just an example. But that was the concern. But then when the church stepped in, it framed essentially this situation, this policy, in ideological terms, and added metaphysics to this. And this metaphysics seems to drive Putin. And actually, if we come back to the 2014 when the war started, because we are talking about the war. It's not a new war. there was a slow war for 8 years. It started in 2014 when Crimea was annexed, and Putin sent his troops, his proxy troops, to the Donbass area. So when that war began, then it was clearly underpinned by this ideology of the Russian world. Many people came to fight in the east of Ukraine with the idea that they are protecting the sacred space of Holy Rus, and they fight against the godless, demonic, diabolic West. That was the idea that drove many to the east, and that idea was inspired, I'm afraid, by the church.
Yes, well, we'll come back to you for a response on that, Clifford, and we're going to continue to talk about the political, social and religious dimension of this conflict. We'll also get into sort of some of the specifics of the way in which the Orthodox Church had a major split in 2018 because of these tensions and the way in which the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox Church have been at loggerheads ever since, and how that plays into this conflict as well. And most important, of course, we are praying and wishing and wanting this conflict and all the havoc it's causing for so many people to come to an end. But how can that happen, given that there is more than simply an economic political situation at stake here? We're going to talk about that as well. We'll be back in just a moment's time. Special edition of Unbelievable, responding to the Ukraine-Russia conflict with my guests. They are Father Cyril Hovorun and Clifford Longley. Can you hear me? Is this working? We've all got used to muting and unmuting ourselves in recent years, but in our confused and divided culture, when Christians feel nervous about speaking up, it feels like God has been put on mute too. Well, this May, Premier Unbelievable the Conference is coming live from the British Library London as leading thinkers help the church and you to find your authentic voice again. Alistair McGrath, John Wyatt, Lisa Fields, Glenn Scrivener, Sharon Dirks, Joseph D'Souza, Phil Vischer, Skye Jitani and more guests will show how Christians can speak with truth and grace in troubled times. Plus, there'll be the global launch of our brand new ministry, helping skeptics to explore faith and Christians to share their faith with confidence. Not only that, your ticket includes our live Big Conversation event with renowned brain psychologist Ian McGilchrist and Christian neuroscientist Sharon Dirks on whether there's a master who made our mind. You can attend in person or online from anywhere in the world. So join me, Justin Brierley, on Saturday the 14th of May for this year's conference in partnership with ADF UK. Find out more at unbelievable.live and let's take God off mute. Welcome back to this week's edition of the show. We're talking about the religious roots of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. This has not been covered as widely as the general sort of geopolitical issues that have obviously been across our news screens in the past week or so. But there is an interesting religious backstory to the reasons, the rationale, if you like. As crazy as it may seem, what Putin has decided to do, there is this sort of mythological idea that an ideological idea driving him forward, as one of our guests, Father Cyril Hovorun, has been explaining. Clifford Longley, who's with us from the Tablet and is a Catholic journalist, has been covering this as well. I mean, sad to say, but Cyril sort of had to say that there is essentially the Russian church behind this. You can see it in the language that Putin has been using. That's obviously very saddening to you, Clifford. What was your response to that?
Well, appalled. When I described before, when I was in Geneva, being warned that on the Russian Orthodox deputation there of 3 archimandrites, one of them was probably KGB, it seems to me that close relationship is still very much intact, and we must regard it in those terms. But what is emerging, it seems to me, is some tension within the Russian Orthodox Church that is still loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. There is evidence, I think, that we have heard that the part of the Orthodox Church which remained faithful to Moscow in 2018 is nevertheless now having serious misgivings about what's happening, so that there is a possible split, therefore, in the Moscow Patriarchate side of the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't know whether Cyril's heard this or to what extent he can confirm it, but it does seem to me that the split, the attack on Ukraine is causing a split within Moscow Patriarch type Russian Orthodoxy. Not just, we will deal with the question of the independent or the autocephalous Orthodox Church in Ukraine in a moment, but at the moment it seems to me there is a split possibly opening up, which could be very influential because Moscow will not want to lose what it would regard as its representative in Ukraine. And indeed, if there is to be any consolidation of what Putin is trying to achieve, then they're going to be playing a crucial role. And if they've gone off in the other direction, they're not going to be there to help him.
What do you make of that analysis, Cyril?
Yes, I agree. And I think this observation is very correct. Indeed, in 2008, as Clifford mentioned, there was a major attempt at reunification of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy. It was facilitated by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. There had been three kind of groups, religious groups, Orthodox churches in Ukraine. They merged. They were supposed to merge into one church, which was to be granted autocephaly, independence in our language, by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And in December 2018, they managed to create an autocephalous church, which is called Orthodox Church of Ukraine. It was granted autocephaly, the Thomas of autocephaly, the document like a chart for independence by the
Thomas,
yes. Patriarchate, the Thomas, exactly. But a part of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy remained in the Moscow Patriarchate. It's a sizable part, indeed. It remains the largest religious community in Ukraine. And now they face a huge challenge because, yes, the Russian Church in Moscow seems to appease still the aggression. The Patriarch keeps silent. Usually he talks about everything, any kind of thing that happens in the public square, he comments on that, and now he keeps silent. Well, with a few maybe remarks which are very obscure, euphemisms which are kind of still difficult to decipher. And the increasing number of priests, especially priests, and seemingly the bishops as well, get disappointed. And there is a wave of declarations coming from the priests. They demand their bishops to stop commemorating the Patriarch. Now, I think half of the dioceses at the moment of this Moscow Patriarchate Church in Ukraine have signed petitions to their bishops to stop commemorating Patriarch Kirill. They try to force the head of the church, Metropolitan Onufry, to do something. They don't know what to do, but to do something about, severing maybe some relations with Moscow. Onufry has published a good statement, where he condemned, the perpetrator. He named things by their names. I mean, he used.
Who has? Just remind me who you're saying.
Onufry, Metropolitan Onufry, the primate.
Okay, right. Yes.
Primate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. Well, it was a bit of surprise for me because he kept silent on the war during all these 8 years. He made only one condemning statement when Russia annexed Crimea and started, the military campaign in the east of Ukraine. That was the only time when he spoke up. Then he kept silent, regardless of the slow war that we had, casualties that we had almost on everyday basis. And now they came back to to make the statement, which was belated but good.
So Kirill has to be very careful. He might lose those parts of the Russian Orthodox Church which were remaining faithful to the Moscow Patriarchate. They may now split away. Could you explain one thing to me? The extreme importance of who you pray for during the litany. It has kind of more than just a symbolic, it's a canonical expression.
Exactly.
If you include, for example, Moscow, the Patriarch of Constantinople, then you are making a very important statement about how you see your place in the world. And if you're not praying for the Moscow Patriarch Kirill, then you're making another very important statement, are you not? Not just a matter of sentiment. It's not just a good manners. It's much more fundamental than that.
Absolutely.
And would as you explain that, Cyril, would you do it for those who are not necessarily at all au fait with the way that the Orthodox Church operates, including myself?
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, it should be said that the system of the Orthodox churches is not very much like the system of the Catholic Church, where they have the Pope. In our case, we have several popes, actually. And it's closer to the Anglican Commonwealth, when there is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and there are provinces which are independent autocephalous. So I think our system is closer to the Anglican system, more or less, which means that if you stop commemorating the Archbishop of Canterbury, you do not fall from communion with the rest of the church. You just switch to another, province. You may commemorate the primate of the Church of Canada, or depending on where you are. So in our case, if they stop commemorating like the Patriarch Kirill, it does not mean that they cut off themselves, from the Orthodox Church per se, but it means that they just leave the jurisdiction of Moscow and switch to another jurisdiction. And Ukraine is interesting that it's plural not just in the terms of religious groups, and indeed we are very plural and pluralistic society. It's also plural in the terms of the Orthodox jurisdiction. So the priests now in Ukraine, they face this dilemma: should they stay under the umbrella of the Moscow Patriarchate by commemorating the Patriarch of Moscow, even if through Onufry? And that is the trick. Because, yes, they want to kind of stop commemorating Kirill, and they want to commemorate Onufry. But Onufry is just a step below Kirill. So through commemorating Onufry, they are still in communion with Kirill, as far as Onufry commemorates Kirill. So that is kind of pyramid that we have. So for them, it is really a challenge. Should they join now the existing autocephalous church, which had been granted autocephaly by the Ecumenical Patriarchate? And many ask themselves this question and still deliberate on this.
And can I just confirm that the Ukrainian, so you mentioned this autocephalous church, which means essentially independent, and there has been this therefore Ukrainian Orthodox Church in existence from about 2018. Where do you stand, Cyril? You are Ukrainian, but do you think of yourself as part of the Russian Moscow, if you like, Patriarchate Orthodox Church, or are you part of this autocephalous church?
Well, I'm outside Ukraine and Russia anyway, so I'm in the diaspora, what we call the diaspora. And certainly what I care about most is to make people in Ukraine, priests in Ukraine, kind of to find for them a solution, try to help them to find a solution. This is really a very difficult dilemma for them. They cannot stay in Moscow anymore because they know that Moscow blesses or at least endorses the war. At the same time, they look for what we call the canonical legitimate solution for themselves. Such a legitimate solution was offered by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but they did not accept this solution for themselves. So they tried to invent a new solution. It's a very difficult task, very sensitive. We still don't have, a pattern which we would suggest them to follow. I suggest, actually, personally, that we need to have a new unifying council, similar to the council that we had in December 2018, when different churches came together and decided to create this new autocephalous church. I believe at this moment, we have the only solution to come together again and to have another council like that, and to find a way of accommodating those who want to switch from Moscow to somewhere. And I hope this may contribute to creating kind of a system which is similar to the systems in diaspora, when under the same canonical umbrella there are different entities, ecclesial entities.
Can we talk about the role of Patriarch Bartholomew, who has, though he's a long way away from this physically, geographically, he has had a crucial role, it seems to me, by granting the autocephalous status to the Ukrainian Church in 2018. But the result of that was that Moscow Patriarchate broke relations with him, and anathematized him, excommunicated him, and so on. A serious schism within the Orthodox family, and various parts of the Orthodox world outside Russia, Ukraine, have had to decide who they side with. And you find, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church, siding with Bartholomew in Constantinople, and the Serbian Orthodox Church siding with the Moscow Patriarchate. I think probably a more political affinity than a religious one, but nevertheless, all the parts of the Orthodox world outside Russia, Ukraine have had to decide which side they're on. Now, it does seem to me that Bartholomew does hold some cards here. He is, I think, a profoundly wise man. He's a very interesting figure, an important leader, and he could have a role in finding a solution to the sort of thing we're talking about. Now, whether or not Kirill and those who support him are anxious to restore their unity with Bartholomew or not, I can't tell. It is, I think, generally speaking, regarded as a sin to take part in a schism. In other words, church unity is not something you can break without certain sinfulness, unless you are forced to. Now, the question is, can he find a way of overcoming the schism? And does Kirill and people around him aware that this schism is undesirable and ought to be overcome? Or are they just prepared to shrug their shoulders and say, well, he can go which way he wants to go, that's nothing to do with us? I don't know the answer. Any idea, Cyril?
Yes, well, you mentioned the schism. I would call it the semi-schism. It's a unilateral breaking of the relations. It was made by Moscow in response to exactly of the recognition of the Ukrainian autocephaly.
So Constantinople has not reciprocated then?
Exactly. For Constantinople, Moscow is still in communion with Constantinople. So if, say, a priest from the Moscow Patriarchate or a bishop comes to Constantinople, wants to concelebrate, they will be happy to do that. But say if a priest from Constantinople would go to Moscow, Moscow would refuse to concelebrate. So this is a unilateral schism, and this is kind of promoted and fostered by Moscow. Moscow wants this schism to exist. Constantinople resists, actually, and the rest of the church resists this schism. And if we mention that all the churches in the Orthodox Commonwealth, except Moscow, refuse to break communion with the churches that Moscow repelled. It means that for the rest of the Orthodoxy, there is no schism. They can celebrate both with Constantinople and Moscow. And I believe this schism, Moscow was instigated to this kind of approach, to this kind of schismatic approach, not by ecclesial concerns, not by canonical concerns, as they say, but by political concerns. I believe personally that the ultimate kind of reason of this semi-schism is the ideologization of the Orthodox life church in Russia. I call it Putinization. And it's something that we need to address, really. And I kind of advocate for this point, that we need at this moment the deputinization of Orthodoxy. The Orthodoxy which has been Putinized, by playing around this idea of symphony, Byzantine legacy, essentially what Putin promotes is a sort of Byzantinism, if you want. So all those things, I believe, constitute the Putinization of Orthodoxy, something that the Western theology experienced in the interwar period, the Nazification of theology, what happened. And after the World War, we had this denazification of theology, getting rid of the ideas like that Jesus Christ was not Jewish, all this kind of stuff that was widely popular in the war period. Now we have a similar process of deputinization of the Orthodox theology. If we manage it, I believe, then we will eliminate this schism.
It's such an interesting point, this deputinization of Orthodox theology in Russia. How will that be achieved, though? Can the rest of the Orthodox Church have any influence on the Moscow Patriarchate, on Kirill?
Yes.
Do they, given the current semi-schism, as you call it, that exists, can they nevertheless still do anything to try and influence that church?
Yes.
It's a key question.
Yes, I hope so. And by coincidence, I don't know. What is happening is that the Ecumenical Patriarchate has initiated an institution, the revival of an institution which is very old, like 2,000 years old almost. The institution of the Council of the Ancient Patriarchates, meaning the patriarchates which had been established in the first millennium, including, at that time it included Rome, but I don't believe Rome will participate in this institution right now. But certainly it will include Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and the Church of Cyprus, which was also established in the 5th century. So they want to call this council by the Orthodox Easter in April, sometime in April. The original purpose of this council was to condemn the intrusion of the Russian Church to Africa, which is another story, an important one, but not very much relevant to what we are talking about here. But this may be an opportunity for this council to address the situation in Ukraine, this deputinization of Orthodoxy. I think what can be updated in our legacy. In 1872, a similar council in Constantinople condemned what we call philitism. Literally in English, it means tribalism. When Orthodox peoples claim for themselves, complete autonomy and exclusivity, if you want, on the basis of their philetic or tribal affiliation or identity. So that was condemned as heresy, philitism. I think it's time now to condemn this Putinism as a sort of an update of the heresy of philitism, and I hope this can be done very soon.
Just pick you up on one point you've made. The earliest narrative you gave me was of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate influencing Putin. But now you're saying it's the other way around. It's the influence of Putin on the Moscow Patriarchate.
Exactly. It's reciprocal.
Am I right?
It's reciprocal. The moment you influence someone, you get influenced by, especially the symphonic relationship that the Moscow Patriarchate has with the Kremlin. It is unfortunately reciprocal. Yes, the Moscow Patriarchate provides the Kremlin with the rhetoric, with the language, and instead it gets affected by the ideas, by the ideologies. It comes back as a boomerang.
And do you feel, Cyril, at this point that, Clifford felt that Kirill had not been outspoken in support of this, but do you think there is actually at this point, Kirill and the Moscow Patriarchate is actually essentially supporting, endorsing, encouraging this war in Ukraine? I'm
sure about that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Cliff, given that, do you think that the West's current approach of sanctions and so on, and who knows when they might choose to get involved militarily as well at some point, depending on how the situation plays out, can that be the kind of way in which this gets resolved, given that there are these underlying sort of religious issues going on, which obviously kind of operate on a slightly different level to all of that, Clifford?
That, I think, is a key question, whether the West has any influence really out of the outcome here. I think one of the things we've established is that the NATO issue is irrelevant. It's been used by Putin as a sort of immediate cause for occupying or trying to occupy Ukraine. But frankly, I think we'd be having a very similar discussion if it were not for the NATO issue, because something else would have provoked it, possibly the situation in Donbass, which has nothing to do with NATO. So I think the question is, does the West have any influence? I think in a funny sort of way it does, because it is there, if you like, of an example of how else to do things, of a different way of organizing a civilized society from the model they've got. And that's one of the reasons why I think Putin fears it, because the ideas that he would like to see embedded in society as the fundamental principles of it are challenged by Western ideas of democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, and so on. None of which are, I think, compatible with what I've called Russian exceptionalism. Exceptionalism is a term you normally come across when discussing why we don't like the way America behaves, because Americans tend to assume that they have a special license to break the rules if it's in their interest to do so. But Russia seems to have adopted a similar principle, that the rules don't apply to Russia, or if you like, a greater good trumps those lesser considerations of the rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, etc. Now, I think that the West example is a very powerful one in the longer term, and I think most people in Russia are aware of it, but they may not want it, but they are well aware that there's a different way of organizing society from the one they're used to, and a freer one, and I would say a more natural one, where humanity can flourish more. Now, I think that another question that arises, therefore, on this connection is, does Western Christianity have any influence or role? It can certainly offer friendship, and you see in the example, for example, of the way in which refugees are being greeted in Poland. Very many of the charities that have mobilized themselves are Catholic charities, Christian charities. The same thing, I think, is true in the other countries where large numbers of refugees have arrived or are going to arrive. Now, that's an important act of mercy, an act of compassion towards people who are desperate for help. Does it have any wider influence? Well, I think it increases the sense of westward-looking sentiment in Ukraine. In other words, what Putin is trying to achieve is to pull them to the east. But when they see the way the West is responding with compassion, mercy, help, assistance, on all the other things we see on our televisions. That, I think, pulls Ukraine opinion towards the West, rather than the opposite direction from the one Putin is wanting. So there is a role there. Now, is there any political role? Does the Holy See, for example, have any leverage here at all? It does have relations with the Kiev Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate, but I don't think either of them are particularly interested in what Pope Francis has to say on the matter. But nevertheless, the Vatican does have a vast international diplomatic network and a considerable pull in private on such matters, and there must be conversations with Kirill and certainly with Bartholomew. I would have thought that the line between Constantinople and Rome has been quite busy over the last few days and weeks. Whether the line between Moscow and Rome has been engaged, I'm not sure. I would think that Moscow at the moment is in very much an isolationist mode. He's not looking at support or assistance or indeed conversations with anybody outside its own sphere. But in the longer term, if we're talking about a month from now, then this may change, and it may well be that some coordinated action, we may or may not know about it, because let's say the Holy See diplomacy is almost done very privately. You may not see what happens, but it does happen. But nevertheless, the opportunities, I think, are waiting to be used, if not at this stage in the conflict, then further down the road. Cyril, can I just ask you, is there a strong anti-Roman Catholic feeling in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine? I know there is one in Russia. They're very suspicious of Rome. But how does the Ukraine Church handle this?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned, Ukraine is much more tolerant and diverse than Russia, and even among the Orthodox, I think the increasing feeling about Rome, the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church. It's more positive. It's getting more positive, certainly. At the same time, this dualistic worldview, which I mentioned, which occupies, has engulfed the minds of many in the Orthodox Church, including Putin himself, sees the world in black and white. And for many, the black side of this world includes, the Pope. I remember a conversation I had soon after the events of 2014. I went to Greece, and I had this conversation with a metropolitan, quite enlightened one, educated one. And I asked him bluntly, what do you think about the events in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Donbass? And his immediate response was, of course it is the Pope who's to be blamed, which is crazy. It's impossible. But this is the kind of mindset that many people have. This is the kind of mythology that I'm referring to. And I think what we need to do is to demythologize this kind of thinking. This includes my deputinization, if you want, of the Orthodox theology would include this kind of, getting rid of this dualistic mindset.
This is why Poland and Lithuania are often mentioned in a historical discussion of these issues, because they were Catholic in the normal sense of the word, majority Catholic, I think, and with the Catholic Church having strong influence over their politics. Certainly before the war, I think it would be true in both those cases. And to some extent also Czechoslovakia and Hungary, substantial Catholic populations there. And reasons, therefore, more reasons for distrusting the West, if you like. It's another ingredient in their hostility towards the West.
Obviously there's a complex religious history here that's playing out in the background to this war. Obviously, at this point, the thing that is uppermost in most people's mind is, can we de-escalate this conflict in any way, or is Putin committed to essentially taking Ukraine on the basis of both the geopolitical and religious sort of, rationale he has for it? And to that extent, as much as we would like, the religious leaders and the Orthodox Church, this council it may be able to have in Easter, that still seems a long way away, though. And by that time, who knows what will have happened. So is there any kind of immediate sense in which you feel there can any pressure can be brought to bear to bring some kind of, de-escalation of this conflict, Cyril? Or is that...
Well, it seems that Putin is resolved to have Ukraine either alive or dead. That's very clear. He is not going to stop. He is not going to stop immediately, even because of the sanctions, even severe sanctions that have been imposed upon him. I don't know what may may happen. Indeed, maybe coup d'etat may help, and there are
In Moscow, you mean?
Yes, of course. Yeah, if his praetors could, do something about him.
If the army gets fed up with with the role it's being asked to
he's
play.
suicidal, and people say
one can almost imagine a sort of Bonhoeffer style situation. He was obviously involved in that plot to assassinate Hitler.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what else can interfere? What other power in this world can help? I don't know, except God. That's why, in Ukraine we have those chains of prayer. Now they are virtual mostly. People come together and pray for the peace, and that is kind of resolve. I don't know what else may happen, may help.
There is one possibility I'd mention too, and that is that Ukraine might be divided between Western and Eastern Ukraine, and that there might be, as it were, a demarcation line between these two.
It was the plan. It was the plan in the past. Nowadays, it seems that Putin wants to take the entire country. He bombards, every single part of Ukraine in the west. Like my family is just like 5 kilometers to Poland, to the Polish border. And they have those sirens there. They bombard Lviv, they bombard, Lutsk. They want to take the entire country. It's not about the separation, the division of the country anymore. It's about, the whole country, whether it survives or stays or dies.
Well, if it were the case that the Ukrainian army found that it could defend the West better than it could defend the East, it might be that a geographical pattern would emerge. Not emerging at the moment, I don't think. I see no sign of it on the maps that we've been seeing of strategic situation, but it could eventually emerge like that. And this is where I think issues, for example, like no-fly zones, become relevant. If there was a Western Ukraine still contesting Russia, who had, in this scenario, successfully conquered Eastern Ukraine, then Western involvement might become a stronger factor. And it's not just a question also of fighter jets, it could also a question of drones. And let's face it, we don't really talk about drone warfare much, but it's a very important factor in this. You could easily fly a drone from Poland, take out a couple of Russian tank convoys, and then go back to Poland, and no one even know it was you who did it.
I think it may happen.
Those possibilities
may already happen.
It may happen indeed. It may be happening.
We'll go to our final break here, gentlemen, and we'll come back in just a moment for some final thoughts on this. What is ultimately a tragic situation. The religious roots of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is what we're talking about on this special edition of Unbelievable Today, and we'll be back very shortly. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. I've been joined on the show today by Father Cyril Hovorun. He's an Orthodox priest and scholar from Ukraine, currently teaching, though, at St. Ignatius College in Sweden. Clifford Longley, Catholic journalist for The Tablet and other publications, has also been here. And I will link to both of my guests from today's show so that you can find out more about the background to this tragic situation that's unfolded. As I've mentioned already, at the time of recording, which is Wednesday, the 2nd of March, who knows, the situations do evolve quickly in these circumstances by the time this show is broadcast. But it's been really helpful, Cyril and Clifford, to hear this background spelled out, which for many people will have simply been ignorant of, all the complexities of the Orthodox Church and the way that's kind of tended towards this sort of nationalistic kind of perspective in Russia especially. Cyril, I mean, there are a number of non-Christians who listen to this show, especially via podcast. We often feature Christian atheist discussions and debates on this programme. And I can imagine something that a lot of them will be thinking about is, well, this is what happens when you bring religion into the picture. There is this sort of narrative that religion is responsible for so much warfare and everything else. And many people may be thinking this is just another example. So what's your response to that, I suppose, simply as a Christian, the fact that these religious tensions have, to some extent, precipitated the crisis we're now looking at?
Yeah, I believe the opposite, that the lack of religion contributed to this war. Putin's atheist background, secularist background, and his wrong education in religion made this war possible. That's my firm belief. Just like during the 20th century, the wars, like the Great War and the World War II, occurred because of the increasing secularization. They were not religious wars. They were the wars of the secularized ideologies, like communism and Nazism and fascism. They were secularized ideologies, and they led to the war. So I think it is not completely correct. It is not helpful to consider this conflict as instigated or inspired by religion. The war is underpinned by bad wrong understanding of religion or by abuses of religion. And this war proves that proper, good religious education is the must, is necessary. Sometimes I also say that it also proves that humanitarian education is the must in our universities. Putin doesn't have a proper humanitarian education. He plays like a historian. He almost behaves like a professor of history, and his history is nonsense. It's very unprofessional, unscholar. He reproduces crazy ideas, and this is the result of his lack of proper humanitarian education and his lack of proper religious education. The solution is not to get rid of religion. The solution is to have good humanitarian and theological education. That's my firm belief.
But given that he does have this mystical view of a Holy Rus that needs to be unified, and that it does have this religious dimension to it, we know that it will be difficult to persuade him out of that. To what extent is that perception shared by the rest of his people, or would you say he really is an outlier on this, and certainly his approach to making it happen is certainly
yes,
in
exactly.
The extreme?
He enjoys a huge support still. There are some surveys that measure his support among the Russians. It is still extremely high. Like his support after the first week of the war dropped only by 10%. Imagine, like 7% of people still believe that he's right. What he's doing is correct, is right. And these people are also poorly educated, theologically, religiously. There are only most 5% of the Russians who are churchgoers, who go to the church, who receive, some kind of theological education. The rest have the same atheistic background. They believe that they are Orthodox, but this is cultural Christianity. They don't believe in God. Most of them don't believe in God, but they believe they are Orthodox. This is exactly a secular thing. That's why the only way to deal with this at this moment, I believe, is to provide people with good, proper theological education and training, and to give them, examples of healthy spiritual life. Yeah.
Clifford, any final thoughts as we start to wrap this up?
Well, the most recent incarnation of Holy Rus we saw was, of course, the USSR, which was by no means a religious organization at all. It was an atheist, profoundly, emphatically atheist, which liked to send Orthodox priests to the Gulag, at the very least to do to them. So, I mean, I don't know that you can necessarily say that religion is at the root of this problem. However, I would say that another question is important. The Western Europe secular mind doesn't make it very, very comfortable with the idea of religious identity. National identity and religion are very strongly unified in the kind of ideology we're talking about. We're not used to that in the West. We tended to sever the link between national identity and religion. When we come across it, therefore, we're a bit perplexed by it and tend to dismiss it. In fact, I think it's a very powerful factor, historically speaking, and in most other places in the world. The Western European mind is not normative of human nature in particular, so we're easily going to misunderstand it when we see a manifestation of it. This applies, I think, also in our relations with Islam, which is another question, but again, it's very difficult for the Western mind to get anywhere near to understanding what is going on inside that kind of identity.
Well, look, it's been really helpful to have both of your thoughts on the background to this. I'm sure many people watching and listening will have just learned a great deal in the process of doing that. But given that we are all three of us Christians here, although from all three of us different sort of wings of the church, what would you like to see as we finish, Cyril, from Christians? What can we be praying into this situation as we all see this tragedy unfolding before us?
Yes, I think this war provides us with an ecumenical opportunity, if you want. We may put aside our differences, we may pray together, and this common action of praying together for peace and helping each other in this situation, helping like refugees. It's a huge humanitarian crisis now. Helping people who are in need. Sometimes even just by moral support, by uttering a good word, a word of consolation may help. And this I hope will bring us together. This will help us to get closer to this ecumenical goal.
We will be thinking and praying for you and your family as well, Cyril, who are there as well. Clifford, do you want to say something just before we finish?
Well, in the immediate, of course, I think what I will pray for is a ceasefire, and I think a ceasefire would actually illuminate many of the things we've been talking about, because it would deny Putin the victory he's after. I mean, the other difficulty I think we have, and again, I'm not quite sure whether prayer can help this, is that I don't see that Putin has an exit strategy. He's so much painted himself into a corner, I don't quite understand how he's going to get out of it, unless he's going to have to start eating his own words. Now, he is at heart a liar. He is perfectly capable of lying to himself, and he could proclaim a victory when in fact all he's really done is created a desert. And I fear that might be the way things are heading. But nevertheless, a ceasefire, I think, would allow things to become ideologically clearer to us. And I think it would become ideologically clearer also in Moscow. And I think they would then realise that they're heading down an absolute cul-de-sac that leads them nowhere.
We will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time, both. I appreciate how busy this time, especially for you, Cyril, is being as you try to respond as well at a personal level to what's going on in your home country. But Clifford and Cyril, thanks for being with me today.
I agree with that entirely.
Thank you, Justin.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.